Welcome to this webcast series where we seek to explore advances in environmental assessment. I'm Josh Fothergill, the founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting, and I'm an expert in impact assessment, and I'm your host and facilitator for this webcast series. So today, what we're going to be looking at is we have, so moving on to the next slide, we have a special focus of this webcast as it forms the first of a four-part mini-series which all explore the Office for Environmental Protection, or OEP's, October 2023 report into environmental assessments implementation in England. This is the first session or episode, and it provides an overview of the OEP's review and recommendations, with the following three webcasts providing deeper dives into the key areas that their review found needed enhancing to improve the effectiveness of England's environmental assessment regimes. I should note we're recording this in early January 2024, so it's before the government has actually formally replied or responded to the OEP's report, so we don't have that as yet, but that should be forthcoming. And all the recordings from this series can be found on Fothergill TC's website as well as the YouTube channel. So without further ado, moving on to the speaker for this first episode. Today, we're joined for this OEP focused mini-series for the first session by Elaine Webb, who is Principal Lawyer at the Office for Environmental Protection. Over to you, Elaine.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks for giving us this opportunity to talk about our report. So as Josh explained, this is the first part of 4 short episodes, which I'm presenting along with my colleague, Emma Hawthorne. And in this episode, I'll provide a high-level overview of who the OEP is and of our recently published report. As Josh mentioned, the next 3 episodes look in more detail at the topics we focused on in the report. And of course, the report itself contains much more detail, and I'd encourage you to have a look. So first of all, a little bit of background about the OEP. We were established by the Environment Act 2021 as a new public body. Our role is to protect and improve the environment by holding government and other public authorities to account against their commitments and environmental law. We have a remit in England, Northern Ireland, and over reserved matters. And we are one of the new pillars of environmental government set up by the Act, alongside environmental improvement plans, targets, and environmental principles. What do we do? Well, we scrutinise environmental improvement plans and targets. We've already scrutinised and reported on the 25-year environment plan, and in January 2024, we'll be publishing our assessment of the first environmental improvement plan. We use the second function on the slide, scrutinising environmental law, to monitor the implementation of the environmental assessment regimes and to write the report which we're talking about now. Our third function is to advise government on proposed changes to environmental law and other matters related to the natural environment. And finally, we have enforcement functions whereby we can investigate suspected serious failures to comply with environmental law by public authorities and enforce compliance where that's necessary. On our website, you can read a lot more about this and see work we've done under all these functions. Aims of this particular piece of work was to scrutinise these 3 assessment regimes: environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and habitats regulation assessment. What we wanted to do was to identify what was working well and where things were not working so well, to try to understand why that was. We mainly focused our work on planning, although we're aware that these regimes operate across a wide range of topics and sectors. We think that any reform of the regimes should be grounded in a clear-sighted understanding of the root causes of the underlying problems with the current arrangements. We're very concerned that any implementation problems with the current arrangements are not carried forward into any new replacement regime. We went about the work. We started it in late 2022. We had a call for evidence and we held a lot of stakeholder meetings. If you responded to our call for evidence or we interviewed you in one of those meetings, we're very grateful indeed, because those elements provided an enormous amount of useful information for us. We're also grateful to the members of our expert panel. There's a mention on the slide of 3 external pieces of work. All these are available on the OEP website. You'll see here that we identified 3 fundamental root causes. They were access to information, the extent of post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting, and access to expertise. And as I already mentioned, we found that these arose less from the law itself and more from shortcomings in the wider planning system that affect the way assessment laws are implemented. We also found that there were not easy fixes for these issues. I'm going to now give a brief overview of these 3 main topics that we looked at, and the subsequent episodes look into this in much more detail. So a brief overview of our findings on data accessibility. We found that high quality and up-to-date environmental data is absolutely crucial. We found that the 2 main issues were that there are no agreed standards regarding the quality of data, and also there is very limited data sharing. We made 3 recommendations related to data. These are aimed at resolving data issues, ensuring that data standards cover the complete data pathway, and also to enable better spatial planning. Root cause was related to post-decision monitoring, evaluation and reporting. What we found there is that mitigation measures and compensatory measures under habitats regulation assessment are of little or no value unless they're successfully implemented, and this relies on monitoring and evaluation. We also found that without adequate post-decision monitoring, evaluation and enforcement of planning conditions and obligations, environmental protection is weakened. We made a number of recommendations here. These recommendations aim to ensure that evaluation is undertaken and regularly reported. They aim to improve monitoring, evaluation and reporting, to ensure independent oversight, and to ensure the coherence of the national site network is protected under HRA. You see, we made 4 recommendations under this topic. And the final root cause that we looked at in detail was access to expertise. We concluded that public bodies require sufficient expertise to perform their role in environmental assessment effectively. In planning, local planning authorities are often the decision maker, so they need access to sufficient environmental expertise. And we found that if there's a lack of expertise or capacity in public bodies, there's a risk that implementation will not be fully effective, and again, this can lead to potential environmental harm. We made 2 recommendations. These are aimed at increasing capacity, and in the longer term and also in the short to medium term, where we recommended that it would be beneficial if government could revise the existing suite of guidance. There are 3 more quotes here from Dame Glenys Stacey, our chairman, making the point that addressing these issues is not just important to improve assessments, but because these matters underpin so much of the government's environmental ambition. Dame Glenys mentioned biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies, for example, which rest on the same foundations and for which the same issues could apply. The next steps are that our report has been laid before Parliament and government must respond before the 19th of January. Our aim is that our report will influence government policy development, including the environmental outcome regulations, planning data regulations, and any planned reform of habitats regulation assessment. And we're also undertaking a series of planned stakeholder engagement. Thank you very much for listening. Do have a look at our website in order to see our full report and the supporting 3 external reports. Don't go away though, as I'm now handing back to Josh for a question and answer session.
Many thanks, Elaine. Great presentation, great summary of the report, and as you indicated, a deeper dive into each of those 3 areas in the subsequent episodes. While we're not live today, we do have some audience questions. We've been able to generate those from some LinkedIn discussions that I facilitated, and also some common questions and queries that yourselves have heard from OEP stakeholder engagement at conferences when you've been talking about the findings of this review back in November, December of 2023. So alongside Elaine, who has been speaking in this session, we also have her colleague, Emma Hawthorne, who is Principal Scrutinising and Environmental Law and Advice Manager. So I'm going to initially ask some questions probably to yourself, Elaine, and then bring Emma in as we delve a bit further into it. So the first question, I guess, was, there's many issues to do with environmental assessment out there. So why did you choose the 3 issues that the report focused on?
Thank you very much, Josh. And I should have mentioned earlier, actually, that part of the context for this work was the Nature Recovery Green Paper and what was then the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. That was one of the reasons why we decided to look at the wider topic. Apologies for not mentioning that earlier. The reason that we chose these 3 particular topics was that these were 3 key issues that arose very early on in our research when we were speaking with stakeholders and also when we undertook a literary review. We obviously identified quite a number of issues, but it was our view that those were the fundamental root causes and that fixing them would really make a positive difference.
Thank you for that. And certainly the issues certainly resonate with me and a number of practitioners that I've spoken to about the subject, both since the report's been released, but also over the years I've been working in environmental assessment. Moving on to another question, you mentioned that the issues don't lie with the legislation. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, of course, Josh. It's easy to blame the legislation and to think it's the law that's at fault. But actually, we looked at the legislation in some detail, and so did the team of barristers at 39 Essex Chambers who did one of the external pieces of work for us. And we found that the issues really lay in the implementation, and that if implementation was improved, the regime would operate as it was intended when it was first designed.
Okay, thank you. I guess, yeah, we've had the legislation for quite some time now as well. So I guess it's had 30 plus years to bed in, although obviously it's changed a bit over those times and over the various sets of legislation. So thank you for that. Perhaps one more question to yourself before we move on to Emma. So obviously in relation to the Office for Environmental Protection, you've set out those recommendations through your presentation there. Is there any particular priority across the 9 recommendations?
No, not really, Josh. We think they're all important, and a great deal of thought and work went into them. We did identify some that we felt were real priorities, though. For example, addressing the skills and expertise question, because as we'll explain in a bit more detail later, we also see that as underpinning our other recommendations. And also some of our recommendations are more closely linked to government's legislative reforms than others. But we hope that action might be taken on all of them.
Yeah, I'd certainly hope so, and I guess we'll well, as I mentioned earlier, we are awaiting the government's response. We're now in early January. I think there's a few more weeks before they're expected to respond. Perhaps moving now on to Emma. So the OEP study, Elaine mentions the fact that there were some additional reports. The one from LUC, Land Use Consultants, looked at other jurisdictions. I was just wondering, why didn't the OEP perhaps take more inspiration from some of those models presented in other jurisdictions?
I think, is that a question for Elaine, because you led on the LUC work?
Yes, I'm happy. Yes,
Apologies.
no problem at all. I'm happy to answer that one. Yeah, very happy. Well, LUC did an absolutely great piece of work looking at regimes in other jurisdictions. But in the time available, we weren't able to fully review the context in which those regimes operate and whether that's appropriate for the UK. There are useful case studies there, but we weren't able to take a great deal of inspiration from them for this piece of work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, some really interesting looks at different things there. The Netherlands, New Zealand, but equally, I can also understand. I read something on LinkedIn over the last few weeks that there's been political change in New Zealand, and potentially their planning regime that is quite new and fresh might be being renewed and refreshed again. So I guess there's always a challenge from being inspired by outside, because the outside might change. So thanks for that clarity there, Elaine. That's really helpful.
Just to add to that, as Elaine said, we do refer to a number of those examples in our report. So I know, for example, in I think the monitoring chapter, we refer to some examples in Hong Kong where they've done very similar, taken very similar approaches to our recommendations, which is very interesting to read, actually.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, some of the members of the Hong Kong Environment Protection Directorate and the Hong Kong Institute of EIA might be dropping in the UK in late April. So hopefully they'll have some opportunity to engage with various parties as they're coming across for a conference that's taking place in Dublin later in the spring. Anyway, back to the questions that we've got here today. So I think this one is for you, Emma, hopefully. So how optimistic are you in relation to whether government will implement the recommendations set out in the report?
Well, this has been touched on in the previous question. As Elaine said, we are optimistic that government will be implementing our recommendations and taking them forward. We've had some very constructive discussions with DLUC and DEFRA. DLUC have told us that our report is very helpful and they intend to be using it as they continue with their policy development. Just before Christmas, they let us know that their policy development on the environmental outcome reports is slightly running behind schedule. So we know that they haven't developed that as far as they'd hoped when we've been speaking to them as we were developing our report. So we've got another meeting with them coming up. That's next week. DEFRA may also be attending that meeting. So as we said, we're optimistic. We definitely know that government is using our report, and we're optimistic that our recommendations will be taken forward. Well, as you said, we'll wait to see what's in government's response in the next couple of weeks.
That's great to hear, and it's great to hear that you've got that ongoing engagement and kind of relationship there. And yeah, I noted again via LinkedIn that the DLUC was recruiting a new environmental assessment person just before Christmas. So hopefully those additional resources shall assist in that process. And then perhaps just a quick final question, which is perhaps delving a little bit more into the detail of it, but I think it fits here. So the report obviously looked at 3 different forms of environmental assessment: environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and habitats regulation assessment. Within the strategic environmental assessment, of course, there is sustainability appraisal. And we had some questions come through the LinkedIn discussion asking, why didn't the report separate out perhaps that more local plan, local authority sustainability appraisal from the wider SEA practice when it was doing its review? Any perspectives on that, Emma?
Yes, I think what I would say there is, as Elaine set out in the presentation, so the purpose of our report was to influence government, and obviously there's a key time when we can do that, and so we had a limited amount of time to carry out this work. So our report is therefore more of an overview of environmental assessment regimes rather than looking at each specific area of application. So, for example, in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, they refer there to 17 different environmental assessment regulations. So we didn't look at each one of those in detail. Having said that, though, when we carried out our research and fairly extensive stakeholder engagement, no unique issues were raised with us for a particular set of regulations or a particular regime. So we wanted to, in our report, recognise that there were, local plan sustainability appraisals, but we've therefore assumed that our findings, those root causes, are relevant to all environmental assessment regimes.
That's great, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are probably some specifics in each of those regimes that those who are involved regularly can bring out. But as you say, as an overview, I think the key messages that you bring out and recommendations are relevant to all. And hopefully, if they do begin to be addressed, then those specifics can also be brought in for the specific areas of application. I think that's got me to the end of my my questions. So I guess all it leaves us really now is to just move on and say thank you to our audience for listening. Thank you to yourselves, to Elaine and to Emma for presenting. I'm Josh Fothergill, facilitator today, and you can find the reports that we've been talking about on the OEP website. The link was on the previous slide, and this recording alongside the other 3 episodes in this series will be available on Fothergill TC's YouTube channel and also on our website. So you'll be able to access those, and please do go look at the 3 deep dives into data, into post-consent and into skills, because they certainly expose a lot more of this great piece of research that's been done by the OEP. So that's all from us in this episode. Thank you very much for listening to the webcast.